Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really short but incredibly explosive period when the United States basically transformed from a nation focused on itself to a full-blown global empire. This is the story of American imperialism, how it all went down, and, why it's still so controversial today.
So, here's the big question we're going to try and answer. After a whole century spent expanding across North America, what made the United States suddenly look outward and start building an overseas empire, grabbing territories thousands of miles from home? What changed?
Here's our game plan. First, we're going to define what this new imperialism actually was. Then, we'll get into three key events that really built the empire. A conflict that got the misleading nickname the Splendid Little War, then a really brutal and often forgotten war in the Philippines, and finally, the wild story of building the Panama Canal. To wrap it all up, we'll look at the legacy of this empire and what it still means for us today.
All right, first things first. Before we can get into the stories, we have to be super clear on what we even mean when we say American imperialism.
Okay, so this was not just more manifest destiny or westward expansion. No, this was something totally different. See, when the U.S. acquired territories like Arizona or Oklahoma, the plan was always for them to eventually become states. But this new imperialism, this was about controlling places like Puerto Rico or the Philippines without any promise of statehood, a lot like the old colonial empires in Europe.
So what lit the fuse? Well, it was really a perfect storm of three things all hitting at once in the 1890s. First, it was about money. A huge economic depression meant American factories are making way more stuff than people here could buy. The solution? Find new customers overseas. Second, military power. Guys like Alfred Thayer Mahan argued that to be a great nation, you need a great navy. And a navy needs global gas stations, or coaling stations back then. The logic was, why just rent a port when you can own it? And third, it was about pride. There was this feeling that to be a real world power, America had to get in the game and flex its muscles, just like the European empires were doing.
Okay, so let's look at the first event that really lit this powder keg. It was a conflict that, almost overnight, would launch the United States onto the world stage as a true imperial power. I mean, just look at this timeline. It's shocking how fast this all happened. The trigger was the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine at Havana, Cuba. Newspapers, in a fierce competition for readers, jumped all over it. They called it yellow journalism. They printed sensational, sometimes totally made-up stories blaming Spain with these huge, fiery headlines. The public ate it up, and the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine," pushed President McKinley into war. Just 4 months later, it was all over.
This famous quote from the Secretary of State, John Hay, just perfectly captures the American feeling at the time. And you can see why they'd think it was splendid, right? The fighting was quick, fewer than 400 Americans died in actual combat, and the victory was total. It felt like proof that America had finally made it to the big leagues. But that feeling, it wasn't going to last.
So here's the kicker. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, did way more than just stop the fighting. For a cool $20 million paid to Spain, the United States bought the Philippines. At the same time, Spain handed over Puerto Rico and Guam and gave up its claim to Cuba. Just like that, in a single treaty, the U.S. had purchased and inherited a ready-made overseas empire.
But that splendid little war had a dark and incredibly bloody sequel. You see, the people of the Philippines had been fighting Spain for their own independence, and they were not interested in simply swapping one colonial master for another. This slide right here gets to the very heart of the whole conflict. The names say everything you need to know. From the U.S. perspective, it was the Philippine insurrection. An illegal rebellion against what they saw as their legitimate authority. But for the Filipinos, this was the Philippine-American War. It was a straightforward fight for national independence against a new invader.
And here's the really tragic irony of it all. Filipino forces, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had actually seen the Americans as liberators. They fought right alongside them to kick the Spanish out. They were completely shocked when the Treaty of Paris basically sold their country to the U.S. like a piece of property. Realizing they'd been betrayed, they turned their guns on their former allies. The war for their independence started just 2 days before the U.S. Senate made it all official. And this war was anything but splendid or little. The numbers on this chart are just horrifying. Over 4,200 American soldiers died. That's more than 10 times the combat deaths from the entire war with Spain. About 20,000 Filipino soldiers were killed. But the most staggering number by far is the civilian toll. Historians estimate that as many as 200,000 Filipino civilians died from the violence, but also from the famine and disease that just ripped through their country. The fighting was just vicious. U.S. forces, frustrated by guerrilla warfare, started using these brutal tactics, burning entire villages, torturing prisoners for information, and forcing civilians into reconcentration camps where thousands died. When word of these atrocities got back home, often justified by really ugly racist language, it ignited a powerful anti-imperialist movement. Famous figures like Mark Twain started speaking out against what they saw as a complete betrayal of American values.
Okay, so with new territory in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, the U.S. suddenly had a massive strategic problem. How do you get your Navy from one ocean to the other quickly? The answer was an engineering dream that had been around for centuries. Cut the Americas in two. Build the Panama Canal.
This whole process is President Teddy Roosevelt's famous big stick diplomacy in a nutshell. First, he tried negotiating with Colombia, which owned the territory of Panama. When they rejected his treaty, he moved to Plan B. Roosevelt sent U.S. warships to both coasts of Panama, literally creating a naval blockade so Colombian troops couldn't stop a rebellion he knew was about to happen. Shielded by the U.S. Navy, Panama declared its independence. And what do you know? The brand new nation immediately gave America exactly what it wanted: permanent control over a 10-mile-wide canal zone. Roosevelt didn't just take the canal, he basically engineered the creation of a country to get it.
And the price for this permanent control over a huge strip of sovereign land? A one-time payment of $10 million to the new Panamanian government, plus a small annual fee. I mean, talk about a bargain price for a canal that would completely reshape global trade and project American power for the next 100 years.
So after a quick war, a brutal colonial conflict, and a massive feat of geopolitical engineering, what did this new American empire actually look like? What was the lasting impact?
Well, in short, these events completely changed the United States. It was no longer this isolated republic. It was now a true global power, with territory stretching from Puerto Rico all the way to the Philippines. It dominated the Caribbean and now had a permanent and very complicated seat at the table in the politics of Asia and Latin America. The era of American isolation was officially over.
And this quote from Senator Albert Beveridge, who was a huge supporter of imperialism, just cuts right to the chase. Sure, geopolitics and national pride were part of it, but underneath it all, this was about trade and money. The Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, they weren't just islands. They were seen as crucial stepping stones to the ultimate economic prize, the massive, untapped markets of China.
And that really brings us back to today. The decisions made in this very brief, chaotic period set an entirely new course for the United States. This whole idea that America has the right, maybe even a duty, to intervene in other countries to protect its own interests, that was really born in this era. So as we look at the world today, it's worth asking, how do the echoes of this imperial moment, our relationship with Cuba, the status of Puerto Rico, our strategic focus on Asia, how do they still shape America's role on the global stage?